next I'd like to welcome David Rourke. I will introduce. So David has 4 children and 9 grandchildren. Dana Maxwell, the oldest, has taken over AgQuest Inc., the research business, with 5 research stations across Western Canada and 26 research crews. Doris is in social work. Dawn and Dorian, along with her husband John, are operating the 6,000-acre grain farm with some seasonal assistance from David and Diane. David has been seriously concerned about the effect of the world's use of millions of barrels of oil equivalents per day and how it is affecting our ecosystem. Since 2015, the time of the Paris Accord, he has been working to see if agriculture can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem to global warming. In 2021, he wrote a book, A Road to Fossil Fuel-Free Farming, an Example and a Challenge. In September, he started his PhD at the National Research Institute at the University of Manitoba. And the thesis is related to what am I missing from Western Canadian agriculture to be in alignment with the needs of the UNIPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. David is working to make their farm net negative. So welcome, David. And thank you for joining us this afternoon. And just again, a reminder, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A and we will get to them in our panel. So thank you so much.
Hi, my name is David Rourke. I'm a farmer from southwestern Manitoba. I've done research for over 46 years. And I've been a student in the past, and I'm a student again. Started a PhD in September. Maybe more importantly, I'm a grandfather to 9 and a husband to 1 for 46 years. I've been asked to explain what I do and why I do it, and my focus is primarily about climate change and the effect that agriculture, or the opportunity agriculture has to have an effect on it. These are some of my contacts, my email, a contact where you can buy a book that I wrote. Rourke Farms Limited has a web page, and I have some of the experiments that I've done specifically for the farm over the last 3 years on there, as well as some writings that I've had post op-eds and some other papers. So why do we need to change it? You know, we all kind of like what we have. It's a good life, except maybe for the last few weeks in the world. But I noticed during the Paris Accord that 197 countries got together and 194 signed an accord that said we should keep the global temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees and hopefully only 1.5 degrees in order to have a good chance of having a reasonable future for our descendants. I also started to notice that various groups and people were talking about climate change. Pope Francis in his encyclical talked about the need to tackle it now. The Pentagon, the central bankers, insurance companies, and then the UN special report on 1.5 came out in 2018, said we're not doing too well in trying to hit 1.5, but if we're going to make it, this is what we need to do, which essentially said we need to stop using fossil fuels by 2050 and sequester as much carbon in the ground as we can. And I have certainly noticed on our own farm there's a large increase in extreme events. We've hail, blow winds that have taken down our elevator or damaged it so that we had to take it down, blown out bins, destroyed augers, destroyed some buildings. And at one time I thought I was sustainable. I was using the 4R fertilizer, I was using zero-till, I was using the latest emission control on our combines, and every time I went to the elevator I had to sign an agreement or a statement that's saying I was sustainable. So, you know, what could be wrong? I took a step back, and this is kind of what I found. We're deficient in soil organic matter. We probably used up 50% or more of the organic matter that was there before settlers came. results in a weak soil food web, and that results in the inability of to use rain and where it falls from poor infiltration and water storage. We're utilizing a lot of outside energy to produce our crops. There's a buildup of hard to control weeds, insects, and diseases over time. We have a decline in the nutrient density of our crops. We're susceptible to the effects of large rain and drought. We're not very resilient. I think we're a large risk to crop insurance and taxpayers and eventually consumers if we can't produce the amount of food that they need. We're large contributors to downstream flooding and nutrient release, large loss of biodiversity, including beneficial insects and birds. We've had increased destruction of some of my best soils through salinity seep. And soil erosion, although it's been less than it was in the first 100 years, still can be a problem even with zero-till. A net loss of nutrients, especially phosphorus, off the farm. And I think over time, if we don't change our ways, we'll have a loss of trust from consumers. We have to move from being part of the problem in global warming to being part of the solution. As a consequence of all that, I wrote a book about a year ago called The Road to Fossil Fuel-Free Farming, an Example and a Challenge. In that book, I more or less asked myself the question, what would I do if I didn't have any fossil fuel-based products in the next, and that was going to be from high price or banning or just not even available. And if that happened in the next 1 or 2 years, what would I do? Would I deny that that's a problem or assume it's a wicked problem and there's no solution for it? Or would I innovate as if our lives depend on it? Well, I chose to innovate, to try to find an example and come up with a challenge for others to come up with better examples to both mitigate and adapt. Agriculture is one of the only industries that can serve as a sink for carbon dioxide removal. We can sequester carbon, and we can do it to a large degree without any regrets in terms of we've got a lot of co-benefits. It increases all those deficiencies that I had on the previous slides and allows us to grow more resilient crops. And I chose to challenge policymakers to enable some of those changes to happen. So in the book, I divide it into 3 sections. The first section is my journey to discovering that global warming is real and that I needed to take responsibility. Section 2 is my example, and in the book I use the regenerative organic zero-till example. But unfortunately, we really can't get there. We don't have enough rainfall to make that happen. I've seen it working in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Iowa, and there's a really neat farmer by the name of Rick Clark who has some videos in Indiana, but he has 40 inches of rainfall, much warmer winters, a neighbor that is an organic dairy that will help chop some of his crops rather than taking them to grain yield. So we're going back to what I call zero-till plus, and we're going to be using the regenerative principles, plants from snow to snow, diversity, cover on the soil, limited disturbance to the soil food web. And if you can, you should add livestock, but we're not going to because of the economics of cattle in our area aren't good. Provincial budget shows a loss of $133 per cow-calf pair on average for Manitoba producers. The third part of the book was the challenge. How can we contribute to fighting global climate change? And I made 22 policy suggestions in there, and I suggest if you don't like them, come up with better ones. I was a bit idealistic in those, in that I assumed that if we had a completely clean sheet of paper that we were reestablishing Western Canada, we might come up with a different plan, but essentially we have a lot of grain farms in Western Canada, and what can we do to make them better? Seth Klein wrote a book last year called The Good War. It's an interesting read, and in it he says, there's 4 markers as to whether the government gets this or not. First of all, they tell the truth that this is an emergency, an existential threat. And they're willing to spend the money, they're willing to create new institutions, and they're willing to use a stick if they need to, essentially banning things and making things not optional. When it comes to how we're doing in terms of emissions, the Kyoto Protocol required that we reduce emissions by 5% from 2012 levels by 2012 from 1990 levels. Well, in 2015, the world was 139%, Canada was 120%, and Western Canada was 143% of the 1990 levels. And that's despite the good things that happen with zero-till, but zero-till allows higher yields, which needs more nitrogen, which requires more fertilizer, and that increases the yield. Canada is 14th highest in per capita emissions at 14 tons until you add in land use and land use changes. We keep breaking up land, draining sloughs, and cutting down forests. Now we're at 24 tons. We're the world's highest user of carbon dioxide equivalents. Canada's starting to put a lot of things in place, Pan-Canadian Framework for Climate Change and Agricultural Climate Solutions. They also have Ag Canada working on some of the things. Ag Canada's developed an emission model, and this just is one example of using that emission model. And this is a PEI farm, 2,000 acres, mostly potatoes, but 85 dairy cows and 180 beef cattle to finish. And if you take the cattle away, the net emissions was 250 tons. If you add the cattle, it was 3,500. So I think this model works, but it doesn't work in terms of using cattle as a way to reduce emissions, and I don't think this farm can make it work in that respect. But I think we need to be careful of some of these models and the data that they're based on, because I think cattle have an opportunity to reduce emissions, and these models at first glance show that we should get rid of all the cattle. The other thing that's happened that we need to be aware of is that the basis of knowledge in which how to build soil organic carbon has changed, and only just recently in the 2018, 2019. These three groups, Sokol, Kallenbach, and Kirchhoff, have assembled a group of information that essentially suggests that it's the soil microbes that make the difference, and the microbes can produce 2 to 13 times more soil organic matter than would be attributed to the root biomass of the plants. And so it's how you treat the microbes that makes a big difference, and thus the regenerative agriculture principles really concentrate on making sure that that soil food web is as healthy as it can be. On the other hand, we have a lot of choices of how we farm. These were all examples of different scenarios on our farms. All can make money, but some have better environmental outcomes and human outcomes than others. This is an example of continuous no-till, organic farming as a variety trial. We had about 22 bushels per acre or less in that trial, but it was continuous organic. In this case, this is what we did on a lot of our farms. There was green manure fallow, averaged 45 bushels an acre, which pays pretty good at $25 a bushel for organic wheat. So it's not that we can't make that work, but we were being hard on our soils. This is another field that we have. We custom seeds for my oldest daughter on her research plot, so it's all conventional. And that was 11 o'clock at night, and it just looked like you could get out and walk on top of that crop. I stopped and backed up, At that spot right there, the combine monitor said 119 bushels an acre. The field averaged on 300 acres 77 bushels an acre. But the only thing that's wrong with that, there's nothing green underneath, there's nothing growing, so we're not getting to that regenerative yet, but that's our goal. So certainly this is the system that will be more environmentally friendly in Western Canada where it's dry. We just have to do the plus part. So how do we do on-farm mitigation and emission reduction strategies? First of all, using the regenerative principles, which is essentially biomimicry, paying attention to land use, adding some trees if it's possible. We should make the best use we can of the products we have to bring in. 4Rs, for instance, for fertilizer management, judicious use of other inputs, perhaps some intensive animal feeding, although I think there's other options with cows in particular, paying attention to manure management, and then looking hard for green fertilizers and green fuels, and that's really exciting and it's really starting to come into play. And I think organic farming has a fit, but it's not certainly a universal answer in Western Canada because of the dryness, I believe. Next thing I wanted to show you is kind of my PhD. I'll be looking through the literature. I'll be looking to develop best management practices for what I call net positive grain farming. I'll be looking for innovative farmers that I can do case studies on and bounce off ideas in terms of best management practices. This East Delphi process is essentially a focus group, but it's going to be a cross-section of field to fork participants, so including government policy people, researchers, farmers, input suppliers, particularly green ones, consumers, retailers, food companies. I want them all to get involved to see how they can help push this process forward. Ultimately, I'd like to have, and I keep changing these names, I missed this one, but I'm tending to call it net positive carbon grain farming in Western Canada. And it's a balance between green fuels, green farmers, regenerative agriculture, sustainable intensification, and green fertilizers. And we're balancing that with the rewards from producing global warming credits, which by implementing some of these best management practices, we can be rewarded just by getting higher yields, and in some cases we might get rewarded by carbon offset credits. And then of course our food market. So what are some of the limitations to getting to that point of net negative farming? Well, I think there's an awful gap in cover crop technology, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. These green anhydrous ammonia and green fuels is coming along. There's a number of companies that are working on these things. Green fuels can be as simple as straight vegetable oil. There are tractors you can buy from the factory in Europe that are factory equipped to burn straight vegetable oil. We can use biodiesel certainly, and we can use things like anhydrous ammonia and H2. Electric tractors and electric combines I don't think are the answer for large scale agriculture, particularly when there's other options available that utilize the same tractor, same engine as we currently have. And then what do we need in terms of incentives? Do we need carbon offsets and carbon incentives and grants from the government, or can we largely improve our agriculture and get paid by the market, the food market? So this just shows some of that plant material from last year that will die over winter, and then we'll sow into it. And we had 32,000 pounds of fresh weight on that or about 5,000 pounds of dry weight. What other things are we doing? Well, the major thing is to try to figure out how to get plants growing from snow to snow, and how can you put cover crops in. And normally we have two choices when we can sow cover crops, at seeding or at harvest. And my wife doesn't like this time. She calls it seasonal seeding disorder, and she's asked me to figure out something better than trying to sow cover crops or winter cereals while I should be on the combine and she's on it instead. So, can we get cover crops to come up 3 weeks after seeding or adventices, or 3 weeks before harvest? The only way we could probably do that in Western Canada is certainly not just by broadcasting, but can we have a cover crop with delayed germination and then sow the cover crop and the cash crop together? Because I know if I tell farmers that they have to seed 80 million acres while they're combining, they're just not going to do it. They might do a little bit, but it's not going to be a widespread answer. If I ask them to put cover crops in a compartment of their air seeder and seed their cover crop while they're seeding their cash crop, if we can get that to work, that would be an answer. We're also looking at as many biological nitrogen sourcing organisms as we can. We may have the first green anhydrous ammonia plant in the world, and we're working on whether or not we want to go with straight vegetable oil or biodiesel, or you can replace diesel fuel with up to 95%, but probably more realistically with probably 50% with anhydrous ammonia. And then we're doing some really current things like using dissolved urea or melted urea to broadcast top dress canola, because of the high fertilizer prices, and some research that has shown that you can get 4 times better efficiency using dissolved urea than soil applied urea. It might be a good strategy for this next year. So the take-home message is anthropological global warming is an existential threat. We need to take it seriously. Agriculture can and needs to be a significant part of that mitigation solution. Whether it's grain or cows, it is in the how. We can be part of the problem, or we can be part of the solution. I warn you not to get caught in the 2030 sustainable intensification trap. Ultimately, we need to eliminate fossil fuels, not based products, not just make them more efficient. We need to be truly sustainable, not just more sustainable. So I hear a lot of people talk about things like sustainable beef, but it's not sustainable, it's just more sustainable. We need to go that much further. We need to optimize that carbon sequestration into useful soil organic carbon, and that gives us that win-win situation where we can produce better, more resilient crops and help reduce the global warming potential. We need to use our resources, our human resources, our financial resources wisely and efficiently to hit that 2050 target where there's no fossil fuel use and optimize carbon sequestration. It's not impossible. Again, my contacts, and sorry I couldn't be there with you directly, but thank you very much for your attention.